Now that we are back, Rajiva, please continue from where we stopped.
Yes, I'm so sorry that it is an old one. Yes, no, thank you for mentioning while I was away some of the things that I did. And I think my deep social concern sprang, as I said, when, way back in the 80s, I was told after the referendum, yes, you were right and we were wrong. And then I realized one needed a greater social commitment, because the type of increasing authoritarianism, which then turned into much violence, was really an absolute mess. But over those early years in the 80s, I'd started doing a lot of work for the council in arts work, radio programs on literature. I very much did producers of SLBC, Merle Williams, Atharamadiyawa, and we did programs on Sri Lankan writing. I did a literary quarter, I did an art scene. And then at the British Council, I started producing various programs for them, because they had a new hall and the lady running it, Zem Sali, wanted me to do a lot of work. And in addition, I had started doing what I call practical introductions to students. The first I remember was romantic poets, where I was trying to get students to understand the difference in the romantic poets. They weren't all just about nature. There's a political dimension. The older poets and the younger poets had problems, and Richard Desai was massive help to me. He got young people, including Ranmali, to read out the poets. Then we did a Romeo and Juliet with two different interpretations, because I wanted the kids to know that you could think about this yourself and decide, was Juliet a very romantic figure, or was she a silly young girl? Was Father Lawrence a very sympathetic man or a bumbling idiot? And so on and so forth. So we did a lot of that. And then, I worked briefly at St. Thomas's as vice principal, but when I discovered the rock there, they sacked me. And then I was asked by the British Council, which had launched the first edition of the New Lankan Review for me, whether I would take up this position, because Zen was going to be librarian. And I had enjoyed my freedom. I'd done some teaching with Richard privately, we had a great time. But I thought, no, it's time I really settled down. So I joined them in 1984. And soon afterwards, Rex Baker arrived. And, it was just fantastic. I loved working for them.
Lovely. I'm going to backtrack again. When you started the New Lankan Review, what was existing before that, or was it one of the pioneering Sri Lankan literature anthologies, Rajiv?
Well, its inspiration was, in a sense, the New Ceylon writing, which Jasmine Gunratna had produced, which had, I think, 4 editions. But you see, after she produced the first or the second, she went off to Australia. And it wasn't the same after that, and she gave up. She produced the 5th later, and I think in the last 2 years, now that she's back here, they've produced some more. But those first were seminally important. Navasilu, the English Association, had some creative writing, but there was much more criticism. And the creative writing in those days was what I call the village well stuff. It wasn't...
That's a famous quote, which you will get to later. Rajiva,
it wasn't sophisticated.
Yeah. Can we just quickly talk about the English Language Association? Because those also, sorry, yes. So because those also would have been quite new, or were you also involved in the establishment
of
those?
They had set it up earlier. Actually, Halpe was the moving figure. But when he went on sabbatical, he wanted Ranjan Gunthekar, who was the other professor of English, to become president, and he wanted me to be secretary. And I actually tried to involve Ranjan in some stuff, but you probably know Ranjan, he's a good scholar, but a terrible lecturer. And, I remember doing for the British Council a program on Lawrence, and he just kept stammering right through. And, I realized I could never ask him again because he couldn't hold an audience.
When was it established, Rajiva, date-wise?
In the 70s, I don't know, because it was in existence when I came.
Nothing existed before that about Sri Lankan English, associations.
No, and it wasn't the Sri Lankan English Association. The English Association was more about British English.
Yes.
It was me that changed it. And after 1 year, I thought this won't do. Yes. So I suggested we should have a new president. Normally a president stay on for centuries. But I started the custom of getting a new president every year. So we had a lovely range, and people who'd never been involved before, because this was seen as a Peradeniya Kalaniya official thing, Ashley and then Ranjan, even though they were very different people. People like A.J. Gunawar, Reggie Siriwal, they got involved. And, they were lively, real people with their feet in the world. Margaret Gunratna of the American Center. You know, we had wonderful presidents, each of whom did a year and then went away, but stayed on the committee if they were interested. Percy Colentome, the judge. You know, so I wanted to expand its impact. And the British Council helped me a lot because we did a lot of programs. And so they were delighted when I agreed to take on the job. And I did mainly literary work, but also Rex allowed me to start producing books. I said, Rex, you know, kids have nothing to read, only the school syllabus. And he allowed me to produce a selection of English poetry way back in 1985, in my first year there, which we sold at 5 rupees. It sold out immediately. Because, you know, what I wanted was, let's say a child read a romantic poem on the A-level syllabus. I wanted to read them to read others. So we had 20 jolly poems. It was so popular. So we read the second edition and then a third. And then Rex let me do a collection of Sri Lankan poetry in English, which was enormous fun. So I was able
rather ironical, isn't it, Rajiva, that your Sri Lankan poetry kind of things come out first through the British Council.
Absolutely. And the reason was that the British Council people then believed in the word. You know, they believed in what they call Commonwealth literature when the English literary establishment in Sri Lanka didn't. I mean, later on, when I tried with John Keller to have discussions on, you know, changing the syllabus, I found Colombo, for instance, had one short story by Punyakanta Wijesinha. And then the only other Commonwealth literature was African drama, only because Nelufudi Bell had gone and got a PhD in that. But nothing more Sri Lankan, nothing of Indian writing. And India was, you know, the best model at that stage for good writing. And we should have been working with those people. So the British Council had a much greater awareness of where we were heading. I remember now Ranjan Gunatilaka, who took over the chairmanship of ACLAS from Ashley and clung to it. That one, you know, I wasn't able to make any change over regular turnover. And since then, I think it's gone back to Peradini and stuck there. But Ranjan put no common literature on the syllabus. And I remember the International Secretary General telling me, yes, we do have some people who, you know, are supposed to promote common literature, but don't think it's English literature. So there was nothing of that. Whereas Reggie had put stuff on.
Right. It's interesting, the word English, even Rajiva, with me, I can say when I say English writers, I mean Sri Lankan English writers, I also mean people living in Sri Lanka, as opposed to Sri Lankan English writers. So my first question, like my question to you, was it the first Sri Lankan English Association? I meant the first association by Sri Lankans for English at class.
Well, I don't know what happened earlier, but I think Ashley was seminal in organizing this in the 70s. Because he wanted to have more activity.
Let's go back to a New Lankan Review, Rajiva, because that was my exposure to, you know, and that was basically all literature, right?
Yes. All great. No, it was creative writing, but you see what happened is in 1982, when I was sacked from St. Thomas's, Richard and I started teaching at a little house which my father was looking after. We spent the day there, and in between classes we take to writing. That's when Richard used to produce wonderful poetry, and I always believed what I told. So he told me to by a friend of his, and I told him this boy's a genius. And then after 3 months, he said, well, actually, it's me. It was great writing. And then I said, let's produce a magazine. So we sat there doing this. But in addition to the creative writing, I also had an account of my time at St. Thomas's, which was written sort of tongue-in-cheek. It was called Slippery Pantaloons, after Shakespeare's Slippered Pantaloons, because, you know, the guys in the governing body didn't care at all.
Rajiva, we better not criticize personal people here.
No, I want to put in individuals, don't worry. Okay. But, you know, can you imagine a board of governors where the only people who had children sent them to Royal College? Because the education at St. Thomas's was no good. But they didn't bother about the kids who had to face this bad education. It was a time when the warden said, you know, when the A-level results were so bad, our boys come from a class that doesn't need to go to university. Can you imagine that being accepted? It's just so irritating. But then I also had an interview with Shiva Naipaul. Vidya's brother visited us. And that was a lovely piece. He was such a fascinating character. He died the next year. He died very young. So it was an interesting cross-section. And we launched it at the British Council. And I still remember the hoots of laughter when some of the stories I'd written were read. And of course, the most electrifying moment there was when Richard read G. Narasimha's Nallu, because we didn't realize what was building up. And this was a couple of weeks before the riots of July 1983 burst out. So, that's when I sort of realized I needed greater commitment. But having joined the British Council, I produced these anthologies, Sri Lankan writing in short stories. I actually brought out a book of wonderful short stories only by women. There was Maureen Seniratne, whom I very much like, Vijitha Fernando, Nirmali Hettiarachchi, 2 stories each, and 6 by Punyakant. And later it became a text because it was so readable. But I also got Nirmali Hettiarachchi to do, adapt easy reading books. And the first stories for easy reading was to take English famous stories, not all of them famous, but things like Evelyn, which was a A-level text at the time, and put it in a Sri Lankan setting.
It still is, by the way.
Yeah.
Yes.
And, it's a good story, but it wasn't well taught. It didn't, there were some people who said Evelyn was very wicked to leave her family.
Yeah.
And Joyce's whole point is that, she needed the freedom. That's what Dubliners is about.
Right. Yeah. Rajiva, let's get to guilt. Is guilt also becoming a reality during this time where you're talking about easy readers? Was it happening in parallel fashion?
It's an interesting thing because I produced all these books. Guilt was started by a man called Wilfred Jayasuriya in 1987, I think it was, or maybe 88. And it was a very good idea because it was to keep people occupied. Sri Lanka has the largest gap between exams and work. And it should have started earlier, but it was...
Exams and university entrance, I think.
No, and the next bit of work. So between O-level and A-level, there's...
Okay.
It's endless gaps. Sri Lankan children waste more time. And there have been efforts to change it, but no one has had the guts. Tara Demel tried, but she was promptly overborne. And, it was Mahinda Rajapaksa who had, wanted to make change. But now the present government is talking about cutting the gap. They should ask Tara because she's the one who knows how to do it. Anyway, as I was saying, this was to give people who were admitted to university English before the university began. And it was run by Wilfred Jayasuriya, I think from the Minister of Education in those days. And he wanted readers. And he'd asked the Canadians for money. And the Canadians said yes. But they asked the British Council to advise. And John Keller told me to take charge. And I said, let's do 10 short readers. Wilfred wanted 3 massive books, one in science, one in arts, etc. I said, no, we should have fun and increase general knowledge. And Wilfred didn't quite like it, but the Canadian head of aid just turned to me and said, yes, you have good ideas, but we are not interested. We'd prefer to go with what the British Council has proposed. And I had a fantastic time. We set up an office. They gave us money. Nirmali Hettiarachchi was chief editor. Some of my cats came and worked there. We hired people. And we produced 10 wonderful short readers, including Gulbai Gunasekara, whom I got to know well then, did bits of history. And she always tells me, Rajiva, I don't mind working for you because your whole point is let's have fun. And I tell her, let's have fun. And she'd produce superb short articles on things that people left out. There was a time when the Minister of Education managed to produce a history syllabus that left out the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. The ignorance was startling. So I got her to make short notes on those. And we had others, Janaki Galapati, who later became Vice Principal at Ladies, did a lovely selection on science. 4 books for which she got university lecturers of enormous skill to write simple readers. I mean, we had to simplify them still more, but Nibin was marvelous at that. And they were so readable. all flesh is grass, how, animals build up through vegetable matter. It was marvelous. So those books did very, very well. And the Gelt students loved them. But of course, I wasn't involved in the organization of Gelt. I did, with Wilfred, I did some seminars. But then Wilfred suddenly fled abroad. I remember in the JVP days, he had a seminar, which was attended by 7 people, 4 of them ministers. Because no one else was willing to get out on the streets. It was a JVP Hattal. The only teacher who turned up was a sweet old lady from Natra, who later I knew, who walked. And then there was Wilfred and me. And then Wilfred told me, I'm actually leaving tonight. He was under threat. And he went off to America and actually got a degree in English. Before that, he was economics. So that was Gelt. And we produced those books. And then the Canadians loved me so much because they really knew I got heaps of money from Canada after that to produce primary readers. And then when I started work, went back to the universities, books for that. Because in the early 90s, the British Council changed. Mrs. Thatcher stopped it being an age agency and wanted it to be a money-making agency. It was really quite awful. And we had bosses who, were horrible. I mean, 2 of them said, it is not the business of the British Council to take bread out of the mouth of British publishers. They wanted to stop the low price books program. But the kids I was directing at couldn't afford British books. And if you created the reading habit, which John Kelleher and Rex Baker understood, you were actually encouraging students to read. So 1 or 2 of them might actually buy another book. Anyway, I realized this wasn't working, so I got the Canadians.
Also, at a personal level, Rajiva, that's where you got me involved. I had to simplify, localize Black Beauty, which I did as Ratta. And then Animal Tales, Sri Lankan folk
Animal Tales, which was a marvelous book.
About Sri Lankan folk tales,
So those were the primary readers. Yes. And I'm so proud of the people who helped me. I mean, you did those 2 brilliant books. They were really much loved. Then Sibyl Wijesinghe did the illustrations for me. A chap called Bandula Pires, who loved me because I'd done an exhibition in the British Council of his art at a time when Wuhan was persecuting him. He did sketches. Prasanna did so. The writers were marvelous. Chitra Fernando from Australia did something for me. So we had this lovely set of books, and they just sold like hotcakes because we kept the prices very low. And these books really went out all over. And meanwhile, John Kelleher had got me involved in teacher training. He was marvelous the way he changed me from being a, toffee-nosed literature specialist into someone who cared about English language teaching. He, John Kelleher, and the group of consultants we had, the new British Council actually lost all the consultants. So we had people like David Woolger, Jamie Drury, and they got me to do a lot of classes in the rural areas. And I would travel with Nirmali. We took Paru Nagasundaram, who was one of my students at Peradeniya, one of the best, who by then had gone to Pastunwata and then to the NIE. And we would take these caravans with books and do classes for rural students. The Canadians and the Australians funded some of these. I started, that was a bit later. But anyway, that was happening. And then the new British Council didn't want me involved. And they were jealous of me because when the Lalita Atharamadiyawa, the Minister of Education, wanted me involved in teacher training. And I don't think they could cope with the cultural affairs officer who was on first name terms with the minister. But by then I had the Canadians involved. And just when I was wondering, can I go on with this terrible situation? Arjuna Alivihar developed the brilliant idea, he's the best UGC chairman we've had, of what were called affiliated university colleges. He wanted more practical courses because universities, as you know, are generally high bound. And I met him at a party and I said, why don't you do something about English? And he's a very wise man. He looked at me and said, you must talk to Mahinda Palihawardena. Next morning, Mahinda Palihawardena turned up in my office. Because when Arjuna wanted an English diploma course for students who didn't have advanced level English, all the grand universities, Peradeniya, Kelaniya, and Colombo, just sniffed at it. And it was only taken up by Jawadnapura, where A.J. Gunawardena was the head, but he was on sabbatical. So it was the Dean of Arts, Mahinda Palihawardena, Professor of Sanskrit, who really drove the program. And when I met him, it's quite interesting now though. I always like to know whom I'm dealing with. I'd never heard of him before. So I asked the Professor of Sinhala in Colombo, who happened to be your father, what is Mahinda Palihawardena like? And JB said to me, he's the greatest gentleman I know. And JB is one of the great gentlemen one knows, a man of utter decency and elegance. And so was Mahinda Palihawardena. And Mahinda got me involved. There's a girl called Geeta Premratna, but she was a very junior person. And she let me redevise the course. I had to work with the ladies of the year too, who were producing not very good books, but I transformed them. But then they were very pleased because I gave them all the full credit. Damayanti Ahankama, there was a sweet old lady called Mrs. Dharatna. And Chitra Vikramasuriya, Professor of Colombo, who was another feisty old lady, she had got involved. And Ida Dharatna was a great friend of hers and produced this terrible book, and I had to change it completely. And Chitra, I remember beaming at me one day and said, objects is transformed. So we had people, objects, events, interactions. I developed a handbook, which was to introduce basic grammar, because as you know, I had realized grammar is not taught in schools. What they did, they called it an eclectic approach. Then suddenly you do a grammar item, but you can't teach independent grammar items. Like my favorite is 4 forms of the future, which that idiotic Minister of Education introduced, I think grade 6. And no one in England knows 4 forms of the future. And there aren't 4 forms of the future. There are 2, and then there are 2 where you use future markers, like the plane lands tomorrow. So I wanted a systematic approach to grammar, beginning with nouns, verbs, etc. And this handbook proved very popular. And then, as I also got involved in the Guild, which I'll tell you about, I turned it into a handbook of English grammar, which was enormously popular. And last month, I published the 5th edition, because I've realized, I'm afraid, that the students on the master's program at Sabragama, English teachers, people who have various degrees in English from various universities, don't know their grammar. So I've actually made them read this handbook of English grammar, which is now available at Godagates.
Rajiva, you also published in India, right? Your grammar
books. What happened to the handbook, if I might run ahead, is that I produced it for the Guild course. Yeah, it was published here, it was very cheap, but 2 things happened. One is, I was moving away from teaching, I joined the secretariat and all that. 2, none of the other universities was interested. You see, one of the biggest problems in Sri Lanka is, this happened 2 years ago. Ananda Jawadnapura, who was asked to take charge of the new Guild, which still hasn't got off the ground, said, I gather you have materials and why don't we use them? And then I approached him. The next day I found he had been removed from this. And I was told that all the universities were producing their own materials, because it's a money-making exercise. The more materials you produce, you get paid for workshops, and the same materials are never used again or improved. They produce others 5 years later. So none of the other universities would touch my grammar book. But the Cambridge University Press representative in Sri Lanka, a very bright man, loved the books we were doing. And I was interested in by Nirpali. And he said, we'd like to publish this. And I said, very welcome. And they took it over, and I made enormous, I never made any money from the books we did because anything we sold them for was recycled into reprints. That's how we kept it so cheap. Govinda, Cambridge University has published this, and I got massive royalties because they actually sold it to a few English universities, Indian universities. So it was obviously a very good book, but Sri Lanka didn't recognize that.
Yeah, Rajiva, tell us a little bit about the AUCs, because I think we might forget that those existed at some point.
Right. Well, as I said, I got involved in doing the syllabus. Then Geeta came to me and said, will you join us permanently? And I said, no, Geeta, I said, I'll continue at the British Council and help you. And she said, no, I'm going on leave. I'm going to Australia. I've got immigration. And I thought, oh dear. And then I said, but I can work with Mahinda Palewardhan. And she said, he's retiring next year. And then I thought, no, if I don't join them, this program will collapse. Because in any case, it was my prestige, to put it quite bluntly. If Geeta had produced a program, all the elite would have scoffed at her. If Mahinda had done it, even though he was a better academic than all of them put together, they would have said, he's a Sanskrit person, what does he know? But they couldn't say that to me in Oxford PhD. It was. So I joined.
Rajiva, apart from the English factor, what were AUCs? Why were they established?
Well, he wanted to wholly change. No, he wanted to introduce practically oriented courses. So English was the flagship. But, he did things like food science. He did more business-oriented business management.
When was this established? What year?
The AUCs started in 1992. Arjuna Vihara. He was a visionary. And Jawardhan took it up. I remember him telling me once, he invited me to some meeting after I joined Jawardhanpura. He told the world that this is the cutting edge of the university system. And I realized it was true because Jawardhanpura science was roaring ahead. They had started a medical faculty, which, normally when we have a medical faculty, the established medical faculties look down on it. So when Kalaniya started, Colombo and Peradeniya looked down on it. When Ruhuna started, these guys looked down on it. Jawardhanpura caught on almost immediately for two reasons. One was they had very good staff, including Mohan De Silva, who became chairman UGC. Lovely man. He couldn't get his reforms through because the UGC was a terrible institution in his day, but he was really good. And they put Orani Jayans in charge of English. And within a year, her kids were just chattering away in English because Orani had the most wonderful approach to language teaching. And when I joined Jawardhanpura, the old ladies didn't like me. And Orani, who's a great trade unionist, was the most hostile, who was this outsider coming and telling us what to do. But I never quarreled with her because when I went around the university asking people what they wanted, before I did any changes, I checked with the staff. They all told me, can we have Orani Jayans to teach our children? But she had been put in charge of the medical faculty. And then, while I was doing the AUCs, and I did a lot of traveling.
So the AUCs were physically different universities, Rajiva?
Yeah. There were 12 campuses places all over the country.
How many?
About 12, I think, 11.
Okay.
Sabaragamu ran 3 in in Rahangala, Anuradhapura, different universities ran different programs, but essentially Sabaragamu was in charge of 3 and the directors were 3 Sabaragamu people in Anuradhapura, Rahangala in Uva and Belihula. Then you had, I think, 2 in Kulyapita, which I think Colombo ran there. Then there were 2 in Ruhuna, which Ruhuna ran, 1 in the southeast and so on. So I had to run.
What did Jawardhanpura run, Rajiva?
Anuradhapura, Belihulloya, and Rahangala. And they had like food science programs, management, things like tourism management. There were very bright ideas that Arjuna had. Different types of things. I can't give you the whole list, but there'll be, I hope someone archives them.
That's fine, but what happened to them eventually?
Right. Well, I'll tell you, Arjuna had a wonderful plan to develop them. But Wijetunga sacked him 1 year later. And It was a disaster because his deputy, also a wonderful man, Professor from California, who also knew what was going on, was in tension because they wouldn't tell him whether he was staying on for some days. And soon after they confirmed him as continuing vice chairman, he died of a heart attack. I remember being told the news and I was miserable because these two, and I'm so glad because when they were sacked, I went to see both of them. I said, I have so loved working with both of you. And Balasura, I remember telling me, and we have loved working with you. And 2 days later, he was dead. It was horrible. Because they appointed the Chaplain Vice Chancellor Peradeniya, an amiable idiot, as chairman. And the deputy was a lady who didn't know what was happening at the AUCs. And every time I spoke to her, she was a great gossip. She was sleeping for hours in her room. And I said, what are you doing? I'm learning.
Rajiva, you got to edit the personal comments. You've got to edit the personal comments, okay? Because
no one will know whom I'm talking about because it's years ago.
Okay.
But I still remember the head of the AUC in Peradeniya, Polgolla, telling me, he was annoyed because they were leaving them in the lurch. And I said, she's still learning. He said, if you're learning after 6 months, you better go. This is a lovely education. It's called Nihal Hera, who later worked in the ministry, principal of Kingswood. But of course, what happened is the universities realized, which had scoffed at these, that these were godsends for people on sabbatical who had nothing better to do. So they got rid of Hera. They got rid of a splendid educationist at Trincomalee, Shiron Rajaratnam, and replaced them with, third-rate academics with nowhere else to go. But I had to run 3 for Jayawardenepura. And then Trincomalee wanted me to run their English program, Vavuniya to run theirs, that was affiliated to Jaffna, and the Southeastern. So I really had to run all over the country doing this, while also revitalizing English Jayawardenepura. I started a new course. I started 2 English subjects, English language and English literature. But I wanted to make sure that kids who didn't have advanced level English had a good grounding in the language, which they never got in school. The great complaint was these kids coming without knowing any literature because they hadn't done A-level. But my point was they came in with knowing very little language. But the kids who wanted to do it were so well motivated, and they were obviously very bright, because they got into university. And they were marvelous. That first batch at Jayawardenepura, lots of Buddhist monks, many of them extremely bright.
Is that the start of the Jayawardenepura English department, Rajiva? Did that?
Yeah, because earlier
will also come and speak with me in this channel soon. Who will? But you are the first. Paru will come.
Yes. No, actually, the department set up under her because what happened is that I went in to do this, and they followed my idea of 2 subjects for English. People adopting it, an external degree that we started then. I made a mistake there because I did English language, English literature, and Jayawardenepura didn't have English as a subject. No? So my 3rd subject was classics because that was what Kalaniya did, which I think was a bit artificial. So later I changed that. And I'll tell you how I changed that later when I was not there. But then I'm afraid I fell victim to Jayawardenepura intrigues. But the head of department was not really a nice man, and he resented the fact that everyone talked of it was Department of Cultural Studies that everyone talked about as English. And I realized later that the chap who had replaced Palihawardhan, a man called Marasinghe, who was also an academic, later told me that this guy was terrified that either Marasinghe or I would be made professor. I never thought of that because I was quite young. Marasinghe should have and was later. But, we've all been cut down, and he managed, there was rows in Jayawardenepura because the dean, a chap called Wilson, who was a very open-minded, lovely person, resigned because he couldn't work with the vice chancellor. Before that, he had put me in touch to do the English department. I did a draft. I had a committee onto which I had Paru. I had recruited Paru to come and teach for us from the NIA. And he told me, in addition to English people, I'm putting on Professor Silasena Tilakaratne. And I had a meeting with Tilakaratne, and I came back and told Wilson, my God, that man is wonderful. And, he understood everything, straight to the point. And Wilson said to me, Mage Guru. Lovely old man called Tilakaratne, who became chairman of the UGC later. Lively, bright, committed. Okay. I mean, a large, fat man who looked like he couldn't move. But the mind was just so alive and full of new thoughts. It was super working with him. But then we all fell foul of Dorakumara, the Vice Chancellor, who, the first year, I had asked for a contract. At the interview, they said, no, there's no difference. Why don't we make you a full-time member of staff? And I said, okay. But when my letter of appointment came, it said contract. And after 1 year, the students went and demanded I be reappointed. I was. So in the second year when they went, Dorakumara said, no, he must come and ask to be extended. And I thought, I'm not going to ask, because then he'll make conditions like you can't leave the place. He didn't like me going to the AUCs. I would do 12 lectures a week.
Rajiva, can I just say there are many times in my life I had wished our spine was a little bit more flexible, but let's not go there.
Right. Anyway, no, you may be right, but I'll tell you, the reason I decided to go was I couldn't afford to sacrifice the AUCs. I couldn't afford to sacrifice the guilt which I was now taking up. And also the projects I was doing, which SIDA and the Australians and the European Union were all financing for me from British Council days. Student camps for Sinhala and Tamil students for weekends, book projects for libraries in Monragala and Ampare, a project in Girandurukote to teach the children of Mahaveli settlers. So I thought I will not stay on. If he offers me an extension, I'll stay. But if I go from here, Paru will take over. And he was trying to set Paru against me, which is not possible because Paru is such a decent human being. But I knew I could trust her to do what I'd done. So in fact, the plans for the department only crystallized under her. And that was okay because she was no threat to the head of the Department of Cultural Studies. Who had no academic brains in her body. He did, but she was a modest person. She was quite old then. So she was not seen as a threat. So she took things up and continued with them. And also, what Paru is many years later, when I was trying to get the universities to do English language teaching as a subject, and they were all snorting. For them, language teaching is a profession. You don't teach it at university. Paru was the only one who took it up. Now everyone's doing it. But Paru took it up in 2000, I think it was, as a subject for the external degree. And even before that, the Java and the English external degree, the one we started with English language, English literature and classics, became soon the most popular in the whole country. After she introduced ELT, it just took wings, and Paru used to tell me, you don't know the marking I have to do. But of course, being Paru, she did it also conscientiously. So that worked. But to go back to what happened in 1993, is AJ Gunawardena told me they were trying to find a coordinator for GEL because Wilfred had gone away, his successor retired. They advertised and they had found no one inadequate. And he told me he had been on the board. He'd suggested to Arjuna to ask me, but I was abroad at the time. So I called up Arjuna, who actually told me, well, I was waiting for you, but I've asked Orani, and I said, well, can I do it with Orani? And he said, fine. Orani, I think, was not too pleased because she had been looking forward to doing all her ideas. But then she found that, I wanted her to do all her ideas. And I think she realized that, with inverted commas, my prestige was such, because although Orani was a great trade unionist, all the ladies who didn't work as hard as she is didn't like her. Palihavardhan had wanted to make her head of the English language teaching unit. Later, when we recruited Paru, he wanted Dorakumara. And the ladies protested and were very racist about it. It was really quite horrible. She told me, I'll never go into that place again. It was really quite horrible. There was one of them in particular. And many years later, when Paru resigned, I said, you remember what you... because I was very few Tamils at the time. But Orani, who had the racist drop in her body, was so good about that and attacked everybody who attacked Paru. She took on a delightful Tamil, we took on a delightful Tamil instructor, and the other ladies said they don't want him. She took it to the medical faculty. But she and I did GELT together for about 3 years. It was marvelous. She was just full of ideas. She introduced lateral thinking because Arjuna had wanted for the AUCs broad-based general courses. I don't know whether you're aware of this, but you see, Sri Lanka still follows the British system, which assumes that you have your general knowledge at school. You go straight into your subjects. This doesn't work because A, the schooling system is not that good anymore. It used to be good in the public schools of England. The public schools chaps who went to Oxford knew a lot. The Americans in the 19th century started what they call core courses, which is catch-ups for students from all the schools in the country to improve their language skills, their general knowledge, etc. And before I went to Jawadnam, I actually, to Sabrakama as a lecturer, I actually studied this whole thing. The Americans had offered me a fortnight trip into America to watch the election. I said, no, I'm not interested in that. I can't be going around the country with 40 different other people. They said, we'll give an individual tour. What do you want to do? I said, I want to learn about new methods of tertiary education. Two things, core courses. And I got a book about Harvard, which now has 10, or then had 10. International relations, communication skills, empathy, all sorts of things. And I also went to things like community colleges to see how to broad-base education. So we had started some of that with the AUCs. And then Orani introduced lateral thinking. I started doing things like thinking skills, IQ tests to make people's minds move more quickly. All that was a novelty in the university system then. Now people have realized, everyone now talks about soft skills. We were doing it in the 90s. And then we started doing project competitions. Orani was a, mine of new ideas. So we worked together enormously happily. And I used to think she gave me the nice part because I thought anything you supervise, you must check on person. Earlier, people didn't go. I would visit every center at least once, if not twice during the session. We sacked a few people who were not doing any work. I went to one center where there were 6 teachers and 10 students. So I abolished it because they were falsifying. But then I also found about 50 wonderful coordinators. Those dedicated English teachers who were really wonderful with their students. Plenty of them all over the country. And some of them, their English may not have been so good. I remember the man in Bibile who was so good in, his commitment to his students. So we improved this, and I thought I can't give all these up because Dorukumbro will not like it. He will insist that I stay in Jawadnam for 5 days a week. And, I did 12 hours lectures in 2 days. Then I would travel for the next 3 days. So I wanted that freedom. So I let my contract finish. And I continued with all this, the GELT, the AUCs. But then the AUCs changed in that, as Alivihara had intended, they turned into universities. But unfortunately, there was a new government. The new people in charge turned them into traditional universities. You went back to what I would call the old Peradeniya vision of education. And they settled into second-class traditional universities, except for Sabaragama. And that wasn't me, I only joined it later. The director, Pelihula, who became vice chancellor, shared some of Adrihara's vision. There was a man called Somasundara. Later, he and I fell out because I felt there were financial problems, but he was a good educationist. And he said, I don't want a traditional course, I want a major minor course for the arts faculty. You have to do 2 subjects. And he had hired, as head of his social sciences department, a girl called Nireka Veeratunga, very learned, who had a German husband. And the 2 of them were moving, but he had told them to consult me. So we started working on this together. And meanwhile, I was also visiting, along with the GELT and other things, the other AUCs I had worked at, Trincomalee, Anuradhapura, because I continued to coordinate Vavuniya. And they all wanted me to join them. Now they were universities. I wasn't so sure because I had enjoyed my, after I stopped at Jawadnam. I had 2 years of really leisurely activity doing what I like when I liked. I did a lot of writing at the time. I did a lot of traveling. Then I thought, no, it's time I settle down. And, if I join Sabragama, I can contribute. And I asked the registrar, who said, no, you can be a professor. And I thought, So I applied and I was appointed. Then I said, the Americans sent me abroad. So I finally took up my duties at Sabragama in June 1997. And I was allowed to experiment, as I said. And between Nirek and me, we did a lot of good work, started lots of good courses. I got some of my good stuff from Jawaharlal. Incidentally, Mother, I don't know whether you remember when I started at Jawaharlal, I was very keen to recruit you as well. I recruited.
I do remember that was my first interview and yes.
Yeah. And it was terrible because I had two very good girls who had Indian degrees. And the hierarchy at Jawaharlal said, no, we don't know what these Indian degrees are like.
The 3 years, the 3-year rule that your basic degree has to be 3 years is a massive problem. And I must say that Paru Nagasundaram's fight for me finally allowed me to get into the English department at Japura. That happened much later.
You meant 4 years, no?
The 3-year degree.
You had a 3-year degree. Yes.
Yes.
And I said, rubbish. The degrees in England are 3 years. You see, it's America that 4 years degrees because they do the co-course. And of course, they had this sniffy attitude to Indian degrees, which are now generally much better than ours. But the real reason, Madhu, was that they wanted to appoint the daughter of a friend.
Yes, so let's
anyway,
so
I missed you.
Rajiva,
I missed another girl. I don't think you know Rohani Ranasinghe.
I do and admire her very much.
She also was, I wasn't allowed to get in.
And now she's teaching abroad, right, in the UK? So we lose people. Yes.
But in Sabragama, I was able to get some lovely people who had been in my first year at Jawaharlal, including a chap called Manojare Ratna, or rather he was a priest then, a monk, who did a Sinhala degree, but insisted on doing English as his subsidiary, and took up my idea of introducing translation into courses. But we couldn't do this properly. But when government realized it had to be done, the Canadians funded it. Manoj had now become the leading expert in translation in the country. So I had some lovely young people there.
Rajiva, translation is again something I'm very keen after my PhD when I go back to teaching, that we need to put them as a practical syllabus somewhere, and that work would be thesis coming out with which are translations. Rajiva, just to get back to Sabaragama, tell me about the Sabaragama University Press, because were you very instrumental in starting that?
Madhu, I mean, who else does this type of thing? Let me be arrogant. What happened?
I was going to say, let's keep it modest, Rajiva, but yes, you started it. But
no, what happened
was it one of the first of the university presses in this country, or was it not?
It was in the sense that when I started it, I remember Somasundar, who was very cooperative, telling me, yes, someone had a press somewhere, but there's a big distinction between a printing press and what I wanted, which was a publishing house. And the publishing house doesn't need to have a printing press. You get it printed by other people. You see, if you remember, all those books I had been producing had been English Association, British Council first. The British Council, when they went against it, actually very generous. They gave all the books that they had printed to the English Association. And we ran what used to be the British Council bookshop, was run by the English Association for 5 years before they closed it down. We took all the books, including lots of animal tales. Because once when I was away and we had an extra budget, Nirmay told me I wasn't sure what to do, so I printed 20,000 copies more of animal tales. We must have sold about 500,000 copies of books.
And I remember this bookshop, Rajiv. I was manning it at one point.
Yeah, because I would ask people.
Beautifully built.
Yeah, yes. It was beautifully constructed.
Exactly.
And the people running it, I mean.
Just to jump in and say, it was always fun, Rajiva. Somebody got it right. Working with you, Auntie Nirmali, Malti, and Prasanna, it was always fun. That was
it was just a good crew. And as I said, so many people joined in. I mentioned Gulbai Gunasekar, venerable principal of school, the most lively mind you can imagine, bouncing. So that was fun. And Paru. Paru was just such a joy to work with. I had to take on workshops. And, in the evenings, we had to try to teach Paru to play cards, which was not very easy. She was far too nice to play cards. Anyway, the press, I thought, let's the university do it. So I got the Canadians, who once again gave me lots of money to set up this Atharamadiyawa University Press, and we produced for instance, the most important book we produced was a reader for the first years, which I got Gulbai Gunasekar to write. It was called Historic Buildings. And when I put it on my blog, it would get 5,000 hits a day from all over the world, because Gulbai explained the Great Wall of China, the Taj Mahal, historic buildings. So interesting. But then we did a guide to studying and thinking, which incorporated what you see at Sabragam. We did 4 courses. The first term, you had to do 5 general courses, English. Then I wanted to do 3rd language, Sinhala for Tamil and Tamil for Sinhala. And Manoj, my Sinhala lecturer from Javatam for a first class, brilliant mind, said, I think you should do first language as well, because these children come here without knowing to write. So module 2 was written Sinhala or written Tamil, and spoken Tamil and spoken Sinhala. Then they had information studies, not only computer, but I also insisted on library studies, because I found, Madhu, that people came to university without ever having heard of a contents page or index page. One of my first exercises was we got atlases. I got a whole heap of cheap atlases from somewhere. I got it from CUP. And, I would take the first lessons in these myself. And I'd say, now, can you tell me what are the neighbors of China? And these kids are turning pages, looking for. And what I said? And they hadn't been told in schools. Use indexes. So this library studies was really to get them to use books. And, I had to go, while I was doing this, with a couple of lecturers. For Somerson, when he started the AUC, he had to get some academics who were not so good, who were dictating notes. Then there was another thing called scientific thinking, where we did both IQ exercises, what comes next in this pattern, what is the next lesson, plus a little bit of understanding of scientific method, which was written by Ralph Starkloff. And then a general knowledge, a paper where you had to really understand the basics. I wrote a book for this which CUP published, called The Foundations of Modern Society, which looked at seminal periods in human history. The classical, the Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution. But because a lot of it was Western oriented, because I knew that, I started with a whole chapter on the religions, to show that the major religions actually came from the East. But I was also trying to get the kids to understand that, religions have more in common with each other than they have differences. So that was a lovely course. And, I remember later some of my kids telling me, Jomi Sinhala, we didn't know what you were doing, making us do these silly things. When we go for jobs, they want intelligence tests. Then the Sinhala students came and said, you're making us do everything in English. Can't we do it in Sinhala? I said, no, because if you do it in English, life will be very difficult for 2 months, and then the rest of your life will be very easy. If you do it in Sinhala, you'll have a lovely time for the next 2 months, and then the rest of your life will be very difficult. But then I also gave them another argument, which they accepted. I said, but if I do it in Sinhala for you, what am I going to do with the Tamil students? We don't have Tamil lecturers. And students understood asadhara. So I said, I'm sorry, you will all have to do it in English. And after a week, they all settled down. And the next thing I knew was that the Sinhala students who had never known English or Tamil And the Tamil students, because Tamil students were even worse off because the education system had collapsed. Their English was terrible. They who didn't know Sinhala or English were now talking to each other in English and joining together to attack me. They could communicate in English. They were lovely kids, So I really enjoyed that. And of course, that is why Mohan told me when he was UPC chairman. And he said, Sabragama had told him, it was entirely due to me. He said, because of you, they have the best employment record. And I said, you mean of the new universities? He said, no, of most universities. I don't think that was quite true. But he was very impressed with the Sabragama students. And they're still remarkably good. They've tried.
Is this course still valid, Rajiva? They're still doing it?
They're doing some general stuff, but not because there were, as I said, when Nirek and I went, some of the traditionalists got back. They tried to insist on 4-year degrees. And I don't think they do as much. They still have the compulsory English, but I don't think they do as much of the other stuff as we did earlier. It's not as but the staff are trying to do their best, but I don't think it's as comprehensive. After I left, I continued because I went back to being acting dean, and then I went, to more political stuff. And I haven't tried to interfere. I keep in touch because a lot of my staff are there, but it's not my business to tell them what to do unless they ask me.
Rajiva, before we end this conversation, I'm going to ask you something. You opened out the English degree to people who didn't do English for their A-levels. I mean, not the general English paper, but generally, right?
Yeah.
Why? Why did you do that?
No, the simple answer was that at the time I started working, English advanced level was confined to about 10 schools in the country. The Colombo, a few Candice schools, not even Jaffna, one except for one or two, and not even Gaul really in those days. Now, and my view was that there are lots of kids who want to do English, but who are deprived of it through no fault of their own, because their schools don't have advanced level English. That, I think, was one of the best decisions that Arjuna Aliyahara made, the recognition that students who are very bright and should not be deprived of the best tool for lucrative employment, to put it crudely. So that worked brilliant. If you will recall, that led to a massive increase in the number of people who got in on what's called the special intake. Because now there are, I'm sorry, that didn't.
Just to clarify,
no, that didn't.
Those who, like in Javadanapura, those who didn't do A-level English as a subject had to do a placement test, and then they were taken if they passed that. So there, it wasn't a completely open door, but the door opened to those who had a level of English to get into an English department.
But when was that?
This was when the English department degree had a placement test.
No, what years was that?
Probably when I went in like the early 2000s. When you started, was it different, Rajiva?
Well, how we did.
Selected?
No, we had a placement test. That certainly happened. But on the whole, we allowed anyone. You didn't have to qualify because what we wanted was motivation.
What I'm going to ask you the most important question here. How then can you guarantee the quality of the degree that did they fail or did they somehow manage to pass it? If you allow anyone to do English at a degree level, what then would be the standard of that particular degree or the examination?
It speaks for itself in that we were very tough in our teaching. And of course, one of the things I did entirely due to a mistake in my first year, I misunderstood the system and they got twice as much teaching as, instead of whatever it is, 4 hours a subject, they got 8. So they all improved, some more or less than others. There were a few who failed, but they did it again. And even in Belihula, people came back. But no, I don't think we ever let down standards. That is happening now. I just sent off a rocket 2 days ago to some of my former staff. Some of my former students are now on the staff at Sabragama saying, here's a girl who doesn't know one end of the stick from the other, and she said she's a Sabragama graduate. You can't do this. So we kept up standards and we failed. But they knew we would fail them, and on the whole, bright students get to university are bright. Namadu, if they're motivated, they can work. So, as I said, if they got nothing in the test we gave them before, obviously we would discourage them from doing it. I know Manoj, this boy I told you about, wanted to do Sinhala, but he did so well that he tells me that Paru actually encouraged him to do English in one of our best students. So the AUCs was again very different, because the AUCs, they were let in to do English. I don't know whether they had aptitude that before, but I found the situation varied. We were as tough as we could be. I still remember I had to scold a Colombo graduate who taught for us because he was passing people who didn't deserve to pass. I said, you have to fail them. And I still remember, when Pashtun Rata was a mess, it was very good. I asked the English advisor at the ministry, why are you passing these people? He said, we have spent so much money on them, how can we fail them? And I said, you have to. Because unless you...
My fear, was there ever a chance of somebody becoming heartless, or like in Sinhala Atharamadiyawa, because they opted to do an English degree without having the necessary standard to do it, and then not knowing what to do? Could he have ended up without a degree at all?
I don't think that ever really happened, because I know one or two people left us, but they also had psychological problems. They came back and did it. And I met someone doing a postgrad now who reminded me that we had allowed her to come back. So you didn't really have a situation, but that, Madhu, can happen with any course. As you know, the dropout rate at any university is significant, so not large.
I remember something you told me some time ago when we have had conversations on and off in our life. And you said we need to have English degree teachers teaching in rural villages.
Yeah.
So it really doesn't have to be somebody who passes the, say, Colombo English degree in campus and comes. We need people teaching in villages. How are we going to produce them? And you had said AUCs would be a wonderful place to actually get this cadre produced. That way of thinking, maybe we should think of, I was wondering whether you were thinking of a differential standard there, or whether you were generally just saying that.
Well, let me put it this way. One, obviously, if every English teacher is expert in English, so much the better. But they're not going to. Two, they have to have a certain competence, which we guarantee with our degree. Three, as you know perfectly well, many of the products of Colombo and Kalani also don't know their grammar. The classic thing for me is, I don't know how many people you know who have done the Colombo University English for Careers, who call themselves carriers. I have done the CARRIERS course, and they don't even know they're wrong. And I have found, for instance, in the MAs I'm doing now at Sabragama, lapses in grammar are all over the place. Lapses in thinking are all over the place. So we can't aim for perfection, but we want willingness to go and work and improve the standard of the rural students. We also need to have teachers who are empathetic, who won't think. I have a literature degree. Why am I teaching grade 6 English? And I'm very proud of the large number of Sabragama students who did the AUC degree and went into rural teaching, as I am of the diploma students. The number who did the degree and went in are fewer, because obviously, whereas we had, 100 in a batch for the AUC batches, after that it was 20 or so. And some of them were very good and would not go into English teaching. But a substantial number have gone. I still have, in my present MA course, I know what it's like. But two things happened in the late 90s. They started expanding on what they call the special intake. And, when students came in who had A-level English, I tried to stop this at Sabragama because I didn't want the rural kids to feel off-put by people who are much better. If there are 10 people who had A-level English and only 2 who didn't, it was tough. That was one problem. The Second problem, which Paru told me about, because by then I had moved beyond administration. And I think she said, you know, after the GELT stopped, very few students will do it without A-level English. Because the GELT gave the keen ones confidence. You know, let's say there are 50 students in the country.
And was the GELT stopped, Rajiva? And do you know why?
Yes, I can tell you exactly why.
No, I think I better take that question back.
No, I'll tell you why, and I'll try.
When was the GELT stopped?
Well, what happened is about when I was at Sabaragamuwa, Professor Tilakratna told me, you know, UGC should not be teaching English. And the other universities want to run the GELT themselves. You see, they didn't mind too much when Orani and I ran it from the UGC. But when I went to Sabaragamuwa, the idea that Sabaragamuwa is running English for the whole country, you know, envy. So, Silse and Tilakratna said, I think we should decentralize GELT. And I couldn't really disagree because I had so much to do at Sabaragamuwa. So we divided it by province. And everyone else had, the three Colombo universities had a district each, which were very large. We had two provinces because there was no Uva University there. But I also asked Tilakratna whether I could have Hambantota, because it was contiguous and deprived area, whereas Gaul and Matra, much better education. So Ruhuna had those two, and they were very cross with me that I had Hambantota. And Anurad Rajarata had that. But then what happened, Madhu, is that what happened in the first year is that Colombo and Kelaniya realized that they got the largest budgets. But the budget wasn't spent because of very few students came. I still remember the Colombo person in charge, when he asked what percentage came, I said about 30 to 50%. He said, I'll be ashamed to run a course to which only 50% came. The center he set up got 6 students. But the reason, you know, I'm not saying they were bad. You see, right through the history of the GELT, the attendance in the Western province was low. Because Western province students have other alternatives. You know, no one understood this, that the GELT is needed in the other provinces in the country. But then they had the bright idea of saying, you know, what can we keep the money that's left? And Telkar said, yes, we don't want it back. Kelaniya and Colombo realized they could spend all the money on buying computers. Massive amounts. So the next year they didn't even bother about the GELT because they wanted the money to buy computers. Now we were doing our best. I've been looking at the figures in Sabaragamuwa in those 2 years, 98, 99. We were quite good. And I think they were good in Anuradhapura used to ask me for advice because my former AUC instructors were running Rajaratnam. But Colombo and Kelaniya basically took all the money and ran. So after 2 years, they said, this is useless because the students are not coming. So they closed it down. I was sorry about it. But the result is that the real rule, you know, the Colombo people who wanted English.
Closed it down to every province. It doesn't seem fair, but let's, yeah.
Well, what is fair? You see, there was a new UGC that also came now after Tilakaratna went, and they didn't understand. So they want to spend the money. So the GELT was closed down completely to the whole country. Then, as I said, they tried to revive it in the last years of the Rajapaksa government, 14, through the military. When I became Minister of Higher Education, you know, I'm astonished at the amount of work I did in that 1 month. I did a full survey, and all the students said it was very useful. But we'd prefer it not run by the military. So we made plans to start it again. Also made plans to do what I'd long wanted to do, to set up English and maths classes in one school in every division. Between the O-level and the A-level, between the A-level and university entrance. On the pattern of the GELT. And anyone could come. It would be free of charge. And of course, no one was interested after I was. And it was a cabinet paper. I had been told that You can't put cabinet papers, someone is on top of you. So cabinet paper, the minister wasn't interested. He told me he had no interest in education, he wanted to win elections. So all that was really a disaster. And now that the UGC wants to revive it, they're going round in circles. Every time I ask, someone else is doing it, materials are being prepared elsewhere. There's no coherence. You see, they should really go back to the old Gelt, change what is necessary. In one sense, they can't ask me now, I suppose. I mean, Anand Rawatana did. But technically, I suppose the universities want to run it. So that's another disaster.
It's a strange case of politics at different levels getting into play. Rajiva, I think we need to stop because I'm trying to, what I wanted to do today was to show that how many, especially you, have tried to democratize English, have tried to take it to people who don't normally have access to it. And beautifully, like, you know, one thing that you did in campus, for example, right now we have people with PhDs from places like Michigan who came through just because you opened the door for them, you and Paru and everyone else. So, you know, there are incredible success stories, and I can't think of anyone better to open out this to people who really had the talent, but wouldn't have had a path had you not opened those doors for them.
And you mustn't forget, Madhu, I mean, as you know, I'm not a modest person, but you have to remember the massive contribution of people outside the field of English, like Arjuni Alivihara and Mahinda Paliwada.
Exactly. You were my closest contact to that world, Rajiv, and I'm glad you mentioned their names. So, and
can I add something more, Madhu?
Yes, please. Yes.
I think part of it. You see, the other big thing I did, which we won't go into in detail, was reintroducing English medium in schools. And the result of that also, in a sense, took away from my original aim of lots of children without advanced level English coming to university to do English. Because by the time our program had developed and people did advanced level who had done English medium from grade 6, which started in 2001, there was enough advanced level English students all over the country to fill the English department. Because by, let us say, 2008, the more Kandy schools, and they had already had some, the Matra and Gaul and Kurunagala and Kuliapita schools had people. And, you know, I'm glad about that, but I still have one sorrow because all this has happened. The students who can't do advanced level English because their schools don't offer them, but who had done very well in English medium or not even English medium earlier, now are even less likely to apply to do an English degree. And I still believe that there are students in smaller schools all over. Ratnapura, Sabragama district is a case in point. And I wish there were still mechanisms like the GEL to allow them to also apply for English degrees.
Well, always I keep believing in hope. Rajiva, could you just explain what you meant by introducing English medium to schools? Exactly what?
You know, I've always argued for this. And then I happened, Jeevan Tyagaraja put me in touch with Tara Demel. And I said, Tara, why don't you now start English medium? This was way back in 2000. And she said, I'm going to start it in 2 schools, one in Kandy and Colombo, in science. And I said, Tara, that's a disaster. That's elitist. You must make it open. Where do we have the teachers? I said, Tara, there are enough teachers who can take it up if you offer it voluntarily. A school can decide. You're not making any school do it. But if the principal wants to do it and says he has enough teachers, say you can't ask for more teachers, you can start English medium. And Tara was a sensible woman. She rang me that night and said, I'll do it if you come and run it for me. It's a full-time job. But Jeevan told me you have to do it. So I did it part-time, but it worked. We started in that year. We produced materials. We trained the teachers. And unfortunately, the government changed, and the new government didn't want English medium. They wanted it stopped. But fortunately, the Minister of Education, was very supportive.
Rajiva, this was for all subjects or particular subjects, the English medium?
Essentially, it was for, let me put it this way, almost all subjects. I think it was all subjects from grade 6 onwards. Then there were fights and people wanted religion not done in English.
And
people want history.
Did the students have a choice, Rajiva, for picking the medium, or did they not have a choice?
No, of course they had a choice. Any school could decide to do it. And within that school, I mean, no school has only one class. And we had 97 schools or 93 schools that first year. And I remember Karnasena Korito, who was a lovely man, telling me, I said, look, do you want me to continue or not? Yes, 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 you must do it. Then 2 days later, he said, why didn't you start it in Royal? So I said, Mr. Korito, I am not interested in Royal College. I'm not interested in the Colombo schools. I want to do it for rural students. We offered the choice. If Royal didn't take it up, that's not my problem. You see what happened, Madhu, is that educational secretaries who were good propagators. So the Kaduwala zone had about 10 schools. Colombo Central, the director of education didn't like English media. So the only school to start it apart from the private schools, so 2 schools, Ananda College and Asoka Vidyalaya next to it. I remember when I delivered books, I delivered them personally to Anand, and I asked the principal, the sweet man, he was a military man, one volunteers. And I said, why did you stop? And he just looked at me. He spoke Sinhala, he didn't speak English. I am so impressed with that. But Kudituaku did a lot of propaganda, and after 6 months, we had 400 schools. And they were allowed free choice. And of course, the teachers. For instance, there was a little school in Kalutra, seaside school. And the teacher there told me, he was a science teacher. He said, I did English medium science. I was losing my English when you started. It just varied. Some districts had lots. But then because the government was against it, Kodituaku wasn't allowed to continue with me as an advisor. He had to stop appointing me. And I realized it was deliberate because he said, no, they say you must do this full time. So I think I can't do it full time. I'm running a course at the military academy. I'm dean of my university. I can't do anything full time, but I can handle it. Of course, the proof was when I asked the secretary later, did you appoint a full-time person after I went? No. If they were trying to kill it. But fortunately, Korituaku continued with it. It lasted. But my real problem is that the books degenerated. Because instead of the books we had translated, where we put additional value, little exercises in between, there was the traditional stuff in bad English also. Whatever it is, English medium.
Is this still going on, Rajiva?
English medium, oh yes, absolutely. It's going on all over the country. But it didn't fulfill the promise we wanted, because what Tara and I wanted also was to introduce additional value to the textbooks, because the textbooks prepared by the Ministry are pedestrian. So we introduced things. I remember the audit said, "Ogalan dalati ana pote nati ewa." So I said, "Oh, apir kiwanne daanna." Apir kiwa pote tiyena ewa daanna. Habai ඊට අමතරව ළමයින්ට හිතන්න පුළුවන් ඒවා තියෙනවා දාන්න. Little exercises, go and look up certain things. So we did a lot of stuff. All that has gone by the board. And as you can see, even the English textbooks now are back to being the pedestrian stuff they were. It's all very sad, but it hasn't died. And it has led to, let us say, where English was confined to 20% of the country, at least now over 50% has access to English. Not as good as it could be, but it's better. If we can get it to 90%, the critical mass would be reached, and our kids would then take control of their lives in a way they can't.
Rajiva, thank you. I wanted someone to come and show what has been done. to democratize
and what can be done
and
further.
can be done. And I think still can be done, Rajiva, as long as there are fighters like you know, who keep doing it at whatever level. Thank you for coming. And thank you also. We'll do the conversation in Sinhala as well, so that others also will understand what has been done. For this English interview, I shall end it here, thanking you for everything personally, for what you have always tried to do for me and giving me like an example of what can be done in this country, so that, you know, and hopefully younger people than me also will, just a few fighters might still make even a little difference. And we might have to think of little differences now rather than meta differences.
Okay.
If we are to think of, you know, hope for the future. Thank you very much, Rajiva.
Thank you so much for doing this. Okay.